Thank you, Michael. It would be very interesting to talk about where's the difference between challenge and problem and why we are saying challenge instead of problem nowadays. But we don't have that much time, and so I'm going into my presentation. Um, our work in the project consisted of three tasks that are closely related. First, we examined how the relationship between humans and plastics has changed since the early 20th century. Secondly, we ask ourselves to what extent a plastic budget could be implemented in society and politics, and what its implications would be. Thirdly, we originally intended to raise awareness towards the plastic problem, not challenge, through different types of events. But we quickly realized that people were already aware of it. Instead of, we found it important to deconstruct myths and bring expertise into the debate. We need to raise questions about the distribution of responsibility in the plastic crisis. So that's our thesis. So I hope I can bring us to the next slide. Yes, it works. Great. We have researched the plastic-human relationship by looking through articles in the magazine Kunststoffe, which means plastic in German, from the time period of 1911 until the end of the Second World War. From the first issue of the weekly magazine Der Spiegel, which can be regarded as strongly opinionated at least until the 1990s, we took a closer look at all articles that contained the German words for plastics. You know, Kunststoffe, we also searched for plastic with a K, in the headline or in the lead of the text. In doing so, we identified 7 distinct phases in the use of plastics in the German context. First, there was the purely economic fear that raw materials would become more expensive if, for example, the supply of ivory or tortoise shells were run dry, resulting in their procurement becoming increasingly difficult. This led numerous tenders, especially in the US and England, but also in Germany. This largely bypassed the university sector, causing displeasure in the prominent journal Kunststoffe, which was a kind of platform for academics at the time. It seemed as if the companies were always one step ahead of the academic researchers and did not want to share the results. There are a lot of struggle in this journal. At the same time, the symbolic capital of the upper class could be imitated more and more by the working class. In Ida Oberstein, for example, costume jewelry was made as Galalit. Men would wear easily washable white collars made of celluloid, exposing themselves to risk of fire, which led to terrible accidents. In the Third Reich, attempts were made to give plastics a new name. From now on, they were to be called Heimstoffe, which roughly translated as home material or something like that. This happened for 2 related reasons. First, the term artificial, künstlich, was associated with Judaism. Secondly, in the course of the war preparations, the Germans wanted to make themselves self-sufficient in raw materials. Artificial materials were thus to become more popular. With a few tricks, the Germans also set about stealing ideas and patents. We know that style from every country nowadays also. For example, German perlon hardly differed from American nylon. With the beginning of the Unternehmen Barbarossa, as the invasion of Russia was called, it turned out to the so-called Knobelbecher, the boots of the Wehrmacht, were neither suitable for cold temperatures nor for house-to-house combat. So for this purpose, a suitable home material plastic was to be found. In a concentration camp, a 42-kilometer running track was set up and a newly developed plastic for shoes were tested in an inhuman manner. Concentration camp inmates were marched until they dropped dead. Parameters like shoe size or weather did not matter to the Nazis, and in the end, Igelit was turned out to be the material from which the new combat boots were made. Until the 1950s, waterproof jackets were made from the material, and bouillon cups were made from waste product of the production of Igelit. Soon, however, it was discovered that it was a highly carcinogenous substance, and Igelit disappeared from the market. Plastics, and not coal or steel, were the material of post-war reconstruction. Only they made mass production and mass consumption possible. The life of housewives was simplified and time was saved. Time that was filled either with politicization or, to a much greater extent, with leisure activities. This, of course, was also done with products made of plastic. There were even attempts to turn the materials themselves into a lifestyle product. People were supposed to live a Luran life or something like that, as it can be seen here on this advertising poster. This, however, did not catch on. There was no great differentiation. Plastic was just plastic. Plastic gave people the opportunity to not longer remain within the limits of a material, but rather to adapt the material to the desired requirements. This opened up unbelievable possibilities, which, however, remained unused, as mainly mass-produced goods were manufactured. Only substitutes make originals possible. Before artificial leather, there was only leather and no real leather. You can see it as here as echtes Leder, which is called real leather. Synthetics were now fighting for market share against the original. The advantage of shoes made of plastic, for example, was that they could be produced very cheaply. This gave them the status of cheap and worthless. Without further ado, prices were raised in order to gain more appeal among consumers. That was working. Shoe size were also adjusted according to the beauty ideal of small feet. Shoes made of synthetic materials do not wear out. In the realm of sports, former record holders felt that the tartan track was really unfair, because the records from the times when skating was done on ash tracks were tumbling. Figure skating also seemed to be on change. Instead of real ice, skating was now be done on slick, sprayable ice. However, figure skating was scored taking into account the skate marks on the ice. And there are no skate marks on slicks. It never caught on. This pleasure slowly arose towards these materials, and which were still quite new. Plastics were always seen as something that came from abroad, either from the US or China. In the weekly magazine Spiegel, for example, there is a text in which the historical, authentic Asterix and Obelix figures were made of iron and wood, and are contrasted with the plastic Mickey and Donald. The fact that hardly anything, actually nothing about Asterix and Obelix comics is history authentic, apparently did not matter to the authors. Eurosynthetically, they assumed that they were original here, while the non-authentic came from the US and China. This was evident in many song lyrics also. Plastic became a metaphor of lack of authenticity, especially in songs sold on plastic records. That's a paradox, but it is so. Records made of vinyl, however, were considered something authentic because of their analog operation, although they are made of simply polyvinyl chloride and not like Shelley records made from the excrement of about 300,000 lices. So you can also see it in the market of mobility. Lufthansa, Germany's largest air mobility service provider, reintroduced ceramic plates in first class in the 70s. And in architecture, people developed, literally in Der Spiegel, as a healthy disgust for plastic furniture. In the mid to late 70s, all about something like that, the garbage problem slowly began to be addressed. However, it was a niche for the particularly environmental minded. It took until the 80s for it to become a real political issue. Past pro toto, there is the dispute between the first German environment minister and the Coca-Cola company, Germany, over the fight of a deposit on the large plastic bottles. The FDP, Germany's economic liberal party, painted a picture in the Bundestag of dangerous stool classes who might get the idea of searching for bottles in the forest and hand them in a small, innocent kiosk, leading them to a bankruptcy. So they think that wouldn't be fair. Today, this fear has given away, and people are happy to see school classes picking up plastic waste in the forest. The discourse has changed significantly. Sentiment toward products deteriorated as the amount of plastic increased. The notion that consumers act on their desires and political agendas starts to crack when looking how discursively plastics come off quite badly on issues like waste exports. No one really likes products of plastics, but yet goods made of plastics are bought, used and thrown away in ever-increasing numbers and in ever-increasing rates. This shows that supply does not react to demand, but acts through expectations of future demand. Firms imagine a consumer of the future and accordingly offer products in places where they assume ability to pay. For example, Danone suspected that the consumer in the early 2000s, would want to consume ecologically and began experimenting with bioplastics. In 1998, Danone announced that in the year 2001, no yogurt would be sold in plastic cups. 2001 was also the year in which Danone ended this experiment because allegedly the rate of waste disposal by the number of consumers was too high. What is interesting here is that it was supposed to be a substitute for a substitute, which were prompted the weekly magazine Der Spiegel to differentiate between pure and unadulterated plastics and bioplastics on the other side. The search was for a substitute for a substitute. So that's very interesting. We thought we need a substitute for maybe tortoise shells in the early 20th century. And now in the early 20th century, we think we need a substitute for this substitute. That's a very interesting behavior. A watershed year with a watershed essay was 2004. Samson published the essay Lost at Sea, Where is All the Plastic Gone? The problem, which had been dealt with only in an environmental discourse, became a narrative, a naturalist to Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Zauberlehrling, something like a sorcerer's apprentice or something like that. The discourses on health and sustainability then combined. And this combination of discourse is what makes topics very powerful. In this case, powerful enough for the Federal Ministry of Education and Research to create a funding priority from which our project was also financed. This discourse was no longer one of making fun of people with smelly toothpastes. It became a discourse of stewardship, which interestingly was primarily directed at mothers. The tone was, be a good mom, protect your family from microplastics. We conducted a Delphi study among material scientists in this project. The toxicity of plastics has not been adequately researched after all this time. Neither has the persistence of plastic in the environmental already being a consensus among the scientists. But it's still enough to make people afraid. Humans will block or suppress things when afraid. One of the left below, you can see a work of art by the artist Svante Künzel. For 50 cents, you can pull a small toy out of it. These toys are all recovered from the stomach of dead Lisan albatrosses. Künzel said that this would be make people think that people would develop an awareness of the plastic problem. Nothing was further from the truth regarding the majority of the people. Rather, people insulted her. This was not something one ought to children, and it was the South Indian states which dumped all the plastic garbage into the sea. Or that's what the people said to Svante Künzel. This is suppression or blocking of the problem, plain and simple. Therefore, we can keen on bringing the problem right to bringing the people right to the people's doorstep. I was happy to use the example for the lawn trimmer. Since the thread of the lawn trimmer has to be replaced at some point, then I asked people where the old thread of the lawn trimmer went. Is it simply gone away from the planet? Or is it still in the lawn, in the form of microplastics, right where children and grandchildren play? The same can be said for worn out tires. We already heard something about that. So we've got to bring the problem back to where the people live, and don't push it out on the oceans or something like that, because people living in Kaufbeuren, Ingolstadt, or in Bochum are very far away from the ocean. They have to put to go hours and hours of the car to go to an ocean. So we've got to remind the people that it's a problem already here and already in our cities. So much for the 7 phases of the plastic-human relationship. Let's move on to what a plastic budget can do for society, politics, and the economy. The first exploratory research already showed that people are almost blind to the plastic products in their everyday lives. We placed a container with an artwork by Sam Hopkins in front of the Volkwang Museum and asked the curious citizens which plastic products they could do without. Many people answered all or many of them. We wrote down the answers, already aware that those who made such statements probably had not thought about the fact that without plastics they would almost be naked and would not have a cell phone and no glasses and all. Given the complexity of the formula, you can see here, I cannot explain to you, Jürgen Gatling can do this, but I don't, but you see the complexity. Given the complexity of this formula, if one now imagines that a private citizen enters there with the approximately 50,000 types of plastic he consumed, then citizens would certainly be overwhelmed by this. In our opinion, there can be no such thing as a CO2 print for private use. The variety of variety and the use is too diverse. So it is that this formula is too complex for me, and I also think too complex for the people. So we should focus. Jürgen Bettling already talked about it. We should focus on products, nations, enterprises, regions, towns, and so on. So they can use this plastic budget to evaluate. That's what they are doing. So, and if anyone thinks that they never do this, then they never litter plastic. So I guess many of you think I never would do this. As you can see on the picture, that this is very romantic on weddings. So I know no one want to destroy this romantic scene, but this is also littering plastic. So even if it flies before, then it will be littering. So so think about when are you doing this thing? So, and everyone is doing this thing. So also my shoes are emitting microplastics, and also the tires of my bicycle and so on. So we can't avoid littering plastic. So in the world that is like now. So nevertheless, there are very good areas of application of a plastic emission budgets. Nation states, for example. Nation states tend to want to be at the top of rankings. So nation states love rankings, also in soccer and also in sports. How many medals do we have in the Olympic Games and so on? So nation states love rankings. This is made possible by a plastic budget, or a plastic emission budget. Not only individuals like gamification, but also nation states love this challenge character. The same applies to industry and retail chains. They can use such values to show their progress in avoiding plastics and thus become more attractive to young, ecologically minded consumer groups. This can be extended to clubs and associations. The German Football Association or the Catholic Church, for example, are both in dire need of positive press reports. So they can use the plastic budget. In addition, it can be used to assess the effectiveness of laws. This can increase the acceptance of bans among the population because the achievable goal becomes tangible for people in terms of numbers. If the efforts are shown in national figures, the motivations to act also increases. A we feeling is created, and also a social control by others. At first glance, the plastic issue seems simpler than the climate crisis. but it is not in my thought. Our stakeholder dialogue and the countless citizen dialogues clearly showed that. From this, we were able to derive a number of these and that are closely related to the fact that firstly, we are dealing with a major uncertainties in the case of plastic crisis from a scientific point of view. Secondly, these uncertainties are not communicated in the media. And thirdly, in contrast to the climate crisis, the problem is unfolding. First, from the perspective of a juxtapositions of ideologies, the plastic problem is a feel-good issue. Second, a diffusion of responsibilities is taking place. Third, legislative interventions have a high acceptability. Fourth, consumers are being overburdened at the moment. Plastics have a negative image in all relevant ideological varieties, albeit to varying degrees. From a conservative perspective, they represent substitutes that promises little authenticity. They do not fit into national narratives. They are not part of the narrative of the German Trümmerfrauen, so maybe the prize woman, I don't know how to say it in English, the German industrialists that enabled Germans to become part of the community of the states again. Plastics, at least according to the discourse, invade the national economic community from the outside. From an ecological perspective, despite the possibilities of climate protection through the use of plastics, they have been out of the question since the youth instead of plastic movement. There are also no narratives in which the workforce of plastic plants has won relevant labor struggles. In Germany, it always been the steel workers in the Ruhr or the workers on the assembly lines of automobile plants who have served the unions and the political left in their narratives of workers' power, not the plastic producers. The preservation of jobs can only be used as a protective argument from a neoliberal point of view, which from a leftist point of view only means that with every job a surplus of profits is generated. But the expectation of the consumer of the future and the concessions to the zeitgeist, as well as the growth opportunities in the branch of the sustainability movement, which consists of very well-off green voters, little brown plastics have no reliable advocate here either. And on the far right, the days of framing plastics as homewares are long gone. So as you can see, there are no problems between the ideologies by the question of plastic. And I guess this is the reasons why I don't see a big demonstrations on the streets of Berlin or Hamburg or Madrid, where saying we don't want to see plastic products anymore. So there are no demonstrations. There is no social movement about it. It's more about focusing on the individual. So think about drinking from a metal cup, for example. So like I do now. So this is more an individual problem than the climate crisis. This is very interesting that there are many different difference between these two issues we've got to fight in the next few centuries, I guess. Rather, we are seeing a diffusion of responsibility when it comes to plastic. Responsibility is being shared almost equally across the board. This is also a shortcoming of plastic budget. It ignores the fact that supply is not based on demand. So that's my thesis. Offers are instead made where ability and willingness to pay are assumed, and consumers can then only decide between buying and not buying. If one distributes the responsibility equally among the entire population, then a situation analogous to the tragedy of the commons arises. The tragedy of the commons has been used by classical theory in economics and business administrations for decades to argue for responsibility in shared goods. This seems to be evident in the case of responsibility for the plastic crisis as well. If we are all responsible, then for the individual, the responsibility is diluted so enormously that the individual hardly comes into action. However, this situation also has its advantages. It can be stated that people have a high level of acceptance of legal regulations, even though representatives of the companies have always denied this at the events we held. The stricter regulations that have just been overturned by the law in the city of Tübingen, and the reactions in the populations are a clear sign of this. This does not mean that the laws should be not evaluated over a long period of time or should be remained unfounded. For that, a plastic emission budget that is independently calculated or justifiably estimated provides a valuable options. At the moment, however, the dominant idea seems to be that consumers can influence the market with their purchasing behavior, which is only true to a very limited extent. First, this only applies to business-to-customer relationships. Business-to-business relationships, on the other hand, are excluded from the consumer's effective power. Second, consumers are exposed to advertising before, during, and after shopping, which extends to using smells in the retail stores to encourage people to buy. Scientific studies have also shown that ecological framed advertising is largely inaccurate. Thirdly, consumers cannot even see large parts of the plastic they buy when it comes to the outer packaging of the clothing, for example. Third, consumers can't be expected to draw up a life cycle assessment for every single product that is offered for sale. In terms of climate protection, plastic packaging can make perfect sense. Fifth, it is also a question of financial resources whether one can buy ecologically. This leads to increased exclusion of those individuals and families who are not financially well off, who can accumulate less symbolic capital through consumption, and thus lose recognition. Sixth, companies advertise only those products with lower plastic content that are inexpensive to produce. Cosmetic products, for example, are heavily advised but hardly to play a role in terms of quantity and can be filtered out in modern wastewater plants. The major problems, such as tire abrasion, are hardly addressed. So, as you can see, there are many problems which we are facing when we use a plastic budget, but I think we can use it when we use it in a very smart way, it can make a difference. So, but now I don't want to waste so much time because we want to discuss with each other and try to stop my presentation, and it works. And I'm looking forward to a presentation, but I guess we pause a little bit so to fresh us up and catch us a little coffee and so on. And as a thank you for your attention and giving back to Michael.